is Michael Popok with breaking news about Jack Smith and the Jan 6 Committee. Finally, at long last, the Jan 6 Committee, at the demand and request by Jack Smith, has begun turning over all of its 18-month-long documents, records, and witness statements over to the Department of Justice. You heard that right. Prior to just a week or so ago, the Jan 6 Committee had been holding on tightly in a little bit of a turf war with the Department of Justice, clinging on to all of the materials that it developed so that it would have the ability to make a presentation yesterday on Monday for criminal referrals. If anybody thought that up until now the Jan 6 Committee was cooperating parallel with and hand in glove with the Department of Justice and Jack Smith, they were not. In fact, the Department of Justice, even before Jack Smith made his most recent demand, which has now been reported as the 5th of December. Prior to that, Merrick Garland, on not one but 3 occasions, including over the summer, demanded that Benny Thompson and Liz Cheney and the rest of the committee turn over the entire body of their investigative work, not just spoon-feed the Department of Justice information that the Jan 6 Committee wants to spoon-feed it. Even yesterday, on Monday, when Jamie Raskin made the presentation for the Jan 6 Committee about the actual criminal referrals, which is primarily a little bit of political theater, since the Department of Justice is not bound by any such referrals. Even when Jamie Raskin made that presentation, he said, we will also be transmitting to the Department of Justice relevant information concerning these counts. That is wrong. What the Department of Justice should do, with all due respect to the Honorable Law Professor Jamie Raskin, is turn over immediately, without delay, without censoring, without editing, a complete package of 1,000 plus witness statements, many of them sworn under oath, and all of the hundreds of thousands of documents and emails and communications that they and their investigators have been able to obtain voluntarily and by subpoena without further delay. The good news is, now that the Jan 6th has concluded their public hearings, and now we just await for the 1,000-page or so final report to be sent to the public. Now we have reporting that they are starting to turn over streams of information, emails, text messages, witness statements to Jack Smith and the Department of Justice. Particularly, it appears that there's at least 2 work streams that have been given to Jack Smith and his prosecutors. One about Mark Meadows and all of his text messages specifically related to the fake elector scheme that was devised by John Eastman and others, and the interference with the Georgia election prong of the conspiracy, which not only is being investigated by Fani Willis, the Fulton County District Attorney, with her special grand jury in Georgia, but also, coming up from behind, but maybe moving forward in the horse race down the stretch, is here comes Jack Smith and the Department of Justice on the same topic, with even more muscular powers to bring in witnesses and documents around the country that even Fani Willis, who's limited by her, a little bit by her territory of being only a state DA in this context. So we have reporting, confirmation that the Department of Justice has turned over to Jack Smith already in the last week all materials related to Mark Meadows, his text messages, and his role in Georgia in the interference process, and in related to the fake electors. And similarly, John Eastman, really the only other name that the Jan 6 Committee, when they rang the bell yesterday, the only other name that they rang besides Donald Trump time and time again was John Eastman. John Eastman obviously is in tremendous criminal peril because of his own misconduct to overthrow America, of course. Former alleged constitutional law professor John Eastman. I'll take Jamie Raskin, who is a former constitutional law professor, any day of the week on his theories of the Constitution and proper behavior for the different branches of government. John Eastman is a focus, and the Jan 6 Committee is also reported to have now, in the last week, turned over to Jack Smith and his prosecutors all the materials related to John Eastman and the fake elector scandal and everything related to his role in the multi-pronged conspiracy, steps of the conspiracy led by Donald Trump. It's good news for the Department of Justice. It's better news for the American people that the Jan 6 committee is no longer standing on ceremony, no longer protecting its turf, no longer having a political and legal tug of war with the only true prosecutor in the three branches of government, not the Jan 6 committee, but the Department of Justice under the executive branch. It's the only prosecutor. It's the only one that can bring an indictment and make it stick and get a conviction here. And it is time that they are fully and completely given everything the Jan 6 committee has, not spoon-fed, not at the rate the Jan 6 committee wants to do, not to avoid stepping on the publicity of their report, but for the American people, an immediate and complete turnover to the Department of Justice, a leak-proof Department of Justice. So Jan 6 committee's got nothing to worry about. If there's anything that's interesting in those boxes, and I'm sure there are, in these electronic files, mum will be the word until Jack Smith is ready at a press conference to announce indictments, or that he's decided not to indict, which is highly unlikely given all of the information. There's no mystery here about what Donald Trump did. There's no mystery here about what the prosecution would look like. It's just making their way through obfuscation, secrets, and lies of various witnesses and the corruption and witness tampering led by Donald Trump. That is the only thing that's standing between Donald Trump and being convicted, is the Department of Justice and the velocity at which they're operating and how quickly people cooperate with them, including the Jan 6 committee. Now, the multiple advantages, of course, to the Department of Justice getting everything the Jan 6 committee already has. A, they don't have to reinvent the wheel. B, they can compare sworn testimony that they've obtained in the grand jury against witness statements that the Jan 6 committee has to make sure that these witnesses are tracking appropriately from a veracity, credibility, and truth-telling standpoint. You would think that the prosecutors putting on these witnesses at the grand jury would have already had prior statements like obtained by the Jan 6 committee. But again, that has not happened, and they will now for the first time be able to compare grand jury testimony to the testimony obtained or statements obtained by the Jan 6 committee, a very valuable and important tool of the prosecutors to ensure that their case is airtight and waterproof when they take it into the courtroom against one Donald Trump. Also, it may give them information, emails, correspondence, and documents that, frankly, the Department of Justice has not seen in conducting its own parallel investigation. In some ways, the Jan 6 committee was ahead of the Department of Justice because they went first. They really started first. And now with the decision to bring in Jack Smith, he's moving the Department of Justice parallel to it. In some ways, the Department of Justice is ahead of the Jan 6 committee. Recall that the Jan 6 committee really stopped their investigative work about a month ago. Not to say that it's stale, the information they have, but it stopped. And there's certain things and certain barriers and certain privileges that were put up by witnesses, attorney-client privilege by former lawyers or current lawyers who were former lawyers for Trump in the White House or privately, like John Eastman, Pat Cipollone, and others, and Boris Epstein, Sidney Powell, and that group. Then there's a group that put up executive privilege, or at least tried to. That would Mike Flynn, Bannon, anybody else around, Cipollone again, anyone else around the White House. And so the Department of Justice has been able to accomplish that which the Jan 6 committee never could, because they're not empowered to, which is to rip away through a litigated motion adversarial process in front of Judge Beryl Howell, the chief judge in the District of Columbia, rip away these privileges, revealing new information that the Jan 6 committee could only have dreamed about and would be salivating about if they had known about it. So there are ways in which the Department of Justice's body of evidence that's been developed is better than the Jan 6 committee, but there are still many ways in which the Jan 6 body of work is better than what the Department of Justice has at the present time. And so this will help turbocharge the prosecution and have it advance forward in a rapid speed under the whip of Jack Smith. This is Michael Popok reporting on a major breakthrough in the discussions and exchange of information between the Jan 6 Committee and the Department of Justice under Jack Smith's leadership.
At MeidasTouch, we are unapologetically pro-democracy, and we demand justice and accountability. That's why we're spreading our message to Convict 45. That's right, gear up right now with your Convict 45 tees and pins at store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.